The clock struck midnight, and the city outside Alyssa's apartment fell into its usual hush. She wrapped herself tighter in her blanket, the flicker of the old lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Her work-from-home days had turned her nights restless, and the eerie silence of the hour only magnified the hum of her anxiety. Her phone vibrated against the coffee table, the screen lighting up the dark room. Frowning, she reached for it. The number was unlisted, the kind she'd learned to ignore. But tonight, something tugged at her, a strange compulsion that urged her thumb to hover over the green button. "Hello," she said, her voice uncertain. A soft static filled the line, broken by what sounded like distant whispers. Alyssa's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" The voice came through clear then, calm but cold. "You've been chosen, Alyssa. Midnight is your warning. Listen carefully. Everything depends on what you do next." The line went dead, leaving her staring at her reflection in the blank phone screen. Her heart raced, a chill creeping up her spine. Chosen for what? And why did her name sound so unfamiliar when spoken by that voice? She glanced at the clock. The second hand ticked louder than ever, its rhythm almost mocking. Midnight wasn't just the hour, it was the beginning. Alyssa stared at her phone, the unsettling call replaying in her mind. It wasn't just the words that had unnerved her, it was the voice itself. It carried a cold detachment, as if whoever had spoken knew far more about her than she could comprehend. She glanced around her small apartment. The familiar clutter of books and unfinished sketches offered little comfort tonight. Alyssa had always been a night owl, her best ideas coming to life under the quiet cover of darkness. But tonight, the silence felt different, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Her friends would have dismissed the call as a prank, the kind of thing that happened to everyone at some point. But Alyssa wasn't so sure. Ever since she moved into this building 6 months ago, strange things had been happening. The faint tapping noises in the walls that came and went without explanation. The way her TV sometimes flickered to static for no reason. And most unsettling of all, the shadowy figure she thought she saw in the hallway mirror late one night. A trick of the light, she'd told herself, though the memory still lingered. Deciding she needed a distraction, Alyssa pulled out her laptop and tried to focus on her freelance design work. Yet the words from the call echoed in her mind, "Everything depends on what you do next." She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room where the old rotary phone her landlord had left sat untouched. It hadn't worked in years or so, she thought. But tonight, its silence seemed unnerving. The hours ticked by as Alyssa worked, but the sense of unease only deepened. By 2 a.m., she finally gave in and poured herself a glass of wine, hoping it would calm her nerves. She was mid-sip when her phone rang again. This time, the sound was coming from the rotary phone. Her breath hitched as she stared at the antique device. It shouldn't have been possible. The phone's dusty, brittle cord dangled from the wall, disconnected. Yet the ringing was loud, insistent, as though demanding her attention. With trembling hands, Alyssa approached the phone. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the receiver. Was this really happening, or was she losing her grip on reality? Finally, she picked up, pressing the receiver to her ear. A different voice greeted her this time, one she didn't recognize, but felt she somehow should. It was deeper, laden with urgency. "Alyssa, you're running out of time, they're coming." Before she could respond, the line went dead again, leaving her apartment colder than before. Alyssa didn't sleep that night. The apartment felt alive, each creak of the floorboards and groan of the pipes amplified in the stillness. She kept glancing at the rotary phone, half expecting it to ring again, though the silence it now held seemed more ominous than comforting. By morning, the logical part of her brain had regained some control. She convinced herself it was just a strange coincidence. Maybe some leftover wiring in the building had caused a glitch. Still, the words haunted her. "You're running out of time, they're coming." Alyssa decided to investigate, starting with the building's history. She reached out to her landlord, Mrs. DeVries, an elderly woman who lived in the penthouse and rarely left her apartment. Over tea, Mrs. DeVries told her stories about the building, her eyes distant as though reliving the memories. "This place has been around for over a century," Mrs. DeVries said, her voice trembling slightly. "Seen its share of tragedies, fires, disappearances, even a murder back in the 1970s. Alyssa felt a chill creep over her. "Did anything happen in my apartment?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old woman hesitated, her knotted hands tightening around her teacup. "Your unit used to belong to a man named Victor Crane," she said. "He was a radio operator during the war, but after he came home, he became strange. He claimed to hear voices through the equipment he worked on. He tried to warn people, said the voices were predicting something terrible." "What happened to him?" Alyssa pressed. Mrs. DeVries sighed. "One night he vanished, left everything behind. Some say he went mad and ran off. Others believe the voices he spoke of took him." Back in her apartment, Alyssa sat at her desk, staring at the rotary phone. The pieces were falling into place, but none of it made sense. Who were they, and why was she being warned? As night fell, the unease returned. She turned on every light in the apartment, but the shadows seemed deeper than before. Her laptop pinged with a notification, an email from an unlisted address. The subject line read, "Answer the call." Against her better judgment, Alyssa opened it. The message was short. "When the phone rings tonight, you must answer. Do not ask questions, just listen." Alyssa's heart raced as she stared at the screen. The message deleted itself before she could think to say it. Midnight came, and the phone rang again. This time, the sound was distorted, like a recording played on a loop. She picked it up with trembling hands. "Do you hear it?" the voice asked. Before she could respond, a faint static began to grow louder, layered with a low guttural noise that sent shivers down her spine. And then she heard it, faint voices, overlapping and desperate. They weren't speaking to her, they were crying out, begging for help. The static suddenly stopped, and the voice on the line returned. "Alyssa, you must prepare. They'll come for you at 3. Remember Victor's warning, it's your only chance." The line went dead. She turned toward the clock. It was 12:30 a.m. The countdown had begun. The seconds ticked by, each one louder than the last, as if the very clock were mocking her. Alyssa sat frozen in her living room, the rotary phone now silent but radiating a sense of menace. The words of the mysterious voice echoed in her mind, "They'll come for you at 3. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows. The shadows in her apartment seemed to shift, stretching and twisting as though alive. She checked her phone repeatedly, hoping for a lifeline, a call, a text, anything. But there was nothing. She was alone, left to face whatever was coming. As the clock struck 2:45 a.m., the apartment grew colder, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. Then it began, a faint knock at her door. Alyssa's breath caught in her throat. The knock wasn't hurried or frantic, it was deliberate, measured. Knock. 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 Her legs felt like lead as she stood, her pulse pounding in her ears. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty, yet the knocking persisted. Knock. 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 She backed away, her heart racing. Suddenly, the rotary phone rang, its shrill tones slicing through the silence. She grabbed the receiver, desperate for answers. "They're here," the voice on the line said, calm but urgent. "Don't let them in, Alyssa. No matter what you hear, do not open the door." Her gaze snapped back to the door as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. She could hear voices now, muffled but unmistakable, calling her name. "Alyssa, it's us," they said, their tones eerily familiar. "Please, open the door, we need your help." She clenched the phone tightly, her mind racing. The voices sounded like her parents or friends, but they couldn't be. None of them knew where she lived. "Who are you?" she whispered into the phone, her voice trembling. The voice on the line responded, its tone grave. "They are echoes of the lost. They'll say anything to lure you in. Stay strong. Midnight was your warning. 3 o'clock is the reckoning." The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Alyssa held her breath, her eyes glued to the door. Then, she saw it, a shadow, seeping under the doorframe, spreading across the floor like ink. It moved with purpose, unnatural and sentient. The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Alyssa scrambled for her flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows. But the room was no longer her own. The walls seemed to stretch and shift, the furniture warped into unrecognizable shapes. The rotary phone rang again, its sound distorted and mechanical. She answered it, her voice breaking. "What do I do?" The voice replied, calm and measured. "You must face them, Alyssa. The only way out is through. Remember Victor's warning. His sacrifice gave you this chance." The shadow grew, engulfing the room. Alyssa felt its cold grip pulling her toward the door. She clutched the flashlight like a lifeline, forcing herself to move. If she was going to survive, she had to confront the nightmare waiting for her. With a deep breath, she opened the door. The door swung open to reveal an expanse of endless darkness. It wasn't the hallway she expected, but a void, vast, cold, and eerily quiet. Alyssa hesitated on the threshold, gripping the doorframe for support. The darkness seemed to pulse, as if alive, and from within came faint whispers, indistinct yet pleading. Steeling herself, Alyssa stepped forward, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, leaving her trapped in the void. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm, recalling the voice's cryptic instructions. "You must face them, the only way out is through." The shadows around her began to coalesce, forming shapes that grew more distinct with every passing moment. Faces emerged, hundreds of them, pale and haunting, their hollow eyes fixed on her. They didn't move closer, but their presence was suffocating. Alyssa took a shaky breath and spoke, her voice trembling. "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" The figures didn't respond, but the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they formed a single, unified plea: "Help us." Her flashlight flickered, and in its sputtering beam, she saw a man standing at the center of the crowd. He was older, with weary eyes and a face lined with anguish. Alyssa recognized him from the photograph Mrs. DeVries had shown her earlier, Victor Crane. Victor raised a hand, gesturing for her to come closer. Despite her fear, Alyssa stepped toward him, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He spoke only one word: "Listen." The void trembled as the whispers surged, carrying fragments of stories, lives cut short, unfinished business, desperate cries for closure. Alyssa felt their weight pressing on her, their sorrow seeping into her very being. Tears streamed down her face as she understood. The voices weren't evil, they were lost, trapped in a liminal space between worlds. Victor had tried to warn them, to give them a voice, but he had failed. Now it was her turn to carry the burden. With a trembling hand, she reached out to Victor, her fingers brushing against his. The connection sent a shockwave through the void, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The shadows began to dissolve, replaced by a faint, golden light. The faces softened, their expressions shifting from despair to peace. One by one, they faded into the light, their whispers fading with them. Victor was the last to go. He gave Alyssa a faint smile, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice echoing as he too dissolved into the light. The void vanished, and Alyssa found herself back in her apartment. The rotary phone sat silently on the table, its presence no longer menacing but oddly comforting. She felt a strange sense of calm, as though a great weight had been lifted. The clock on the wall read 3:15 a.m. She had faced the reckoning and survived. As the first rays of dawn pierced through her window, Alyssa sat in the stillness of her apartment, the rotary phone quiet but ever present, knowing she was now the keeper of voices that would never be forgotten.